Dush for a follow-up.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate that. Chris, in your report, part of your data, you found that DEP failed to establish a strong relationship between the total expenditures and the number of permits disposed by DEP regional offices, and also the number of full-time equivalents positions. So that, but conversely, the conservation districts showed a strong correlation. First of all, if you wouldn't mind addressing a little bit on how you came to that, and then I'd like to hear a response from the Secretary on this, because again, going back to when we're trying to make the budgetary decisions, if there's not a strong correlation between the number of positions you're requesting and filling and the number of permits being filled, I've got a serious question about what's going on when you're asking for more money.
Sure, we looked at the data the DEP had provided us on their expenditures, their FTEs, and the number of permits that were disposed is the word that they use. You know, as the expenditures went up a bit, permit reviews took a dip from year 1 to year 2 and then came back in year 3. That didn't happen in the CCD data. One of our recommendations is to explore why that's the case. The dip is 1,000 permits. It's a lot. So it could be any number of things. But the concern for us is that while we may not know, we're certain DEP doesn't know because they don't collect data in order to know. They suppose it might be a decrease in the number of permits that came in the door, or they suppose it might be the complexity of the permits. Therefore, it's harder to get them out the door. But they don't collect data on the program in its entirety. They collect data on a part of the program, roughly 35% of the program, and that's the problem. There could be a number of reasons as to why, because it is odd. You would think more people, more resources, more permits disposed. That would make sense. And that's what happens at the CCD level. For some reason, it's not happening at DEP. We're not sure why that is, but the bigger problem is that DEP doesn't know why that is, because they don't collect the data to know.
One of the things that, in responding to Chris and staff, that we stated was that our program is not only permits. We do compliance and enforcement, site inspections. All of those things are included in that. We also do policy, statewide policy, that is then disseminated to the conservation districts to follow. So those components that we have to do that are central office only are not delegated down to the conservation districts. They're kind of removed from those processes. I think in the report, in response to our comments, they were highlighted as indirects, but they are critical parts of our program that take up time and resources to get complete. And those are the same staff that are working on issuing permits. So I don't think that distinction was one of the things that was clear. I think the correlation for the conservation districts is easier because they don't take on that part. We delegate down to them during the permit review and the inspections that are involved with the permitting side. One of the other things to note about our process is that a lot of the other programs within the department do have operation sections. So they have operation sections that go out and do field inspections. They do the complaints, they do all of that. So there's a kind of a line that you can draw. Water programs, for the most part, and in particular in these two programs, are not set up in that way. So we are evaluating having that distinction made. But essentially, it's the same staff and same resources that do all of that. They're not only doing permits.
It's important to note that that explanation doesn't explain the change, because the definition of FTE remained constant over the course of our study. So we use the same definition for the CCDs and for DEP. That's number one. But number two, the definition didn't change from year to year. So even if we got the definition totally wrong, which we didn't, it doesn't explain the change. That's number one. Number two, in cost accounting, and we've had this discussion with DEP, you have to take into account what we do call, it's a term of art. It doesn't mean it's not important, but you take into account indirect activities. That's how we labeled them for simplification of communication. But again, it is a term of art that we use in cost accounting. You have to take into account the components that are necessary to push a permit out the door. That's what you do. Otherwise, you get a wildly inaccurate sense of how much it actually costs to do the thing that you're doing. You know, if you only count, if you're making a part for a car, and I realize this is more complicated, but if you make a part for a car and only count the machine hours and don't count everything that goes into that part, you're going to price the part inaccurately and go out of business. That's how you do cost accounting. The same is true, that's an oversimplified example, but I hope it illustrates the point appropriately, which is when doing cost accounting, you have to take into account these indirect activities or you have a wildly inaccurate cost. And we've talked to them about this repeatedly. I don't check their engineering math.
If you can briefly, I will remind members we still have one more
briefly,
report.
just two things that I'd like to highlight here. The audit only looked at disposed actions, disposed permits, meaning permits issued, did not consider permits received and reviewed during that time frame. And the other highlight here is that I'd like everybody to be aware of is permits vary significantly in complexity. So they treated the permit that disturbs 1 acre the same as the permit that disturbs 500 acres.
DEP's own standards don't take into account complexity.